Now that we know what the sine and cosine functions look like, again, they are graphed right here for you to see. We're now going to talk about two important terms that go along with graphing our sine and cosine functions. And those are what we call the amplitude and the period. There's period, there's amplitude. We've talked about period before in section 6, but I'll reiterate what that means again down here at the bottom. So we're going to start with amplitude first. The amplitude, I like to think of it as what is the highest and lowest point that my functions hit. And in this case, when we graphed sine and cosine, the highest y value that we got to was this value of 1. And the lowest we got to was -1. So we would say that the amplitude is 1. The same thing is true with cosine. Notice that the highest point that I get to is +1 and -1, so our amplitude is just going to be a value of 1. Now, when we did graph our sine and cosine function, we looked at the unit circle. And we started at 0 degrees, and we stopped all the way at 360. Because at 360 degrees, we said that our function would start over again. Even if I look at this sine function over here, started at 0 degrees, at 360, this would be considered one period, or one cycle. Once I hit 360, I start over again. So we would say that the period of a normal sine function would be 360 degrees. The same thing is true for cosine. Even though it starts in a different location, based on looking at the x and y values, whenever we're talking about cosine or sine, we still started over at 360 degrees. Here we were at a height of 1 at 360, we got back to the height of 1, and we started over. So the period would be 360 degrees. To find our amplitude and period, that's going to change though. We're going to say that when I look at a function, y equals a sine of b theta, the a is going to represent our amplitude and is actually based on the radius of the circle that we are dealing with. Remember, our radius of our unit circle is 1, but if I change the radius of the circle, that's going to change how high and how low my function goes. And then b, that is going to affect our period. Now, in order to find our period, we're going to take our normal period, which was 360, and divide it by b. Dividing by b will tell us the number of degrees that represents one cycle. So I have one GeoGebra that I want to show you. Again, our normal sine function looked like this, where I had a radius of 1. So in this case, a would be 1. And since I'm only talking about one cycle, we would have 360 degrees. Okay, there's a normal sine function. You can see height of 1. I know this is in radians. This is 2 pi, but at 2 pi, that's the same thing as 360. So at 360 degrees, we start over. If I manipulate this a little bit, and I change my radius, maybe to a radius of 2, and I change my cycle to 2 cycles, notice what it does to my function. I'm now at a height of 2 and a low of 2. I'm going to stop it now. Notice, though, when I change the number of cycles, from 0 to 360 degrees, which is right here, we normally only had one cycle. But since I changed changed it to 2 cycles, I now have 2 complete sine waves, all between 0 and 360. That's the idea of your period coming into play. The same thing would happen if I choose the cosine function. If I choose cosine, now my height would be 2, and I would still get 2 cycles in between 0 and 360 degrees. Okay, so in example 1, all I'm going to ask you to do is come up with what's the amplitude and what is the period of the function. Okay, so looking at this example right here, find the amplitude and the period. The amplitude and period, I'll write them like so. Remember, when looking at a function, a cosine of b theta, a represented your amplitude. So in this case, since I have y equals 4 cosine of 3 theta, 4 is going to represent your amplitude. And then to find your period, we're going to take our normal period, or our normal degree cycle, which is 360, divide it by 3, and that would get me 120 degrees. So every 120 degrees, I'm going to complete one cycle, which you can see is what's happening on this graph. I have the height of 4, that's my amplitude, it's to a low of 4. This looks to be about 120, looks to be just a little bit farther than 90. From 0 to 120, I completed one cycle. Another 120, completed another cycle. We'll do a couple more. 1a, just again stating what is the amplitude and what is the period. Since there is no a value in front, we treat it like it's 1. Amplitude is 1. For period, we're going to take 360 divided by a half. If we do that, 360 divided by 0.5 is going to get us 720 degrees. So every 720 degrees, we're going to start over again. Finally, in 1b, the amplitude is going to be 3, which is your height. For your period, we're going to take normal 360 divided by 5, which gets us 72 degrees. That's how you'd find your amplitude and period of your sine and cosine function.